I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santamaria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. Now that our Council of 50 series has concluded, it's time to rewind the podcast back to early 1844 to jump back into our historical timeline. From the feedback that I received on the last episode, it's become clear to me that I need to address a few things, and I'm going to do that after the main segment today. But our timeline is just getting into 1844. We jumped ahead to talk about the Council of 50 because we'll see events and factors play into its foundation by the time we hit March of 1844 when it was actually organized. The tendencies for creating a new theocratic government have been present in Mormonism since its foundation, but never had they reached a fever pitch like they did in early 1844, where our timeline currently rests. And as usual, we're going to take our time. 1844 is a woefully complex year of Joseph Smith's ministry. Many would agree the most controversial and complicated year of his entire life. We have a lot to discuss, from the scandals and the high-profile excommunications to political maneuvers and the looming threat of the Nauvoo Charter being revoked, the King Follett discourse to the Nauvoo Expositor to the rolling back of polygamy and sex rings. We have a busy period ahead of us to cover the rest of 1844 with the Council of 50 cloud hanging over our heads. Joseph Smith successfully evading the law in July and August of 1843 revealed how criminally corrupt Nauvoo really was. The citizens of Illinois and Missouri were becoming drained by the constant scandal and cover-ups in the kingdom on the Mississippi, but one person exemplified the corruption that ran so deep through the kingdom of God. This is the story of Daniel Avery and his son Philander Avery. These guys came into contact with a leading anti-Mormon named Levi Williams, who arrested them. Levi Williams is an important anti-Mormon name to remember because he was one of the guys who stood on trial for the assassination of Joseph and Hiram after the Carthage shootout. Well, Daniel Avery was a Mormon horse thief during the Missouri Mormon War in 1838, and he'd garnered a reputation of being a member of Joe's secret cabal of criminals. This is how Marvin Hill and Dallin Oaks wrote of Levi Williams arresting the Averys in their book, Carthage Conspiracy. Quote, "If Thomas C. Sharp was the leading spokesman of the anti-Mormon cause, then Levi Williams was probably the leading actor. His activities made him well known to the Mormons. In December 1843, Williams rode at the head of a mob that forcibly kidnapped a Mormon named Daniel Avery and his son at gunpoint near Warsaw, threatened them with knives, bound them in chains, and took them into Missouri, where they were briefly imprisoned on horse-stealing charges and then released." End quote. So what actually happened here when this leading anti-Mormon Levi Williams arrested Daniel and Philander Avery? Well, Levi Williams was a member of the Illinois militia and indeed an anti-Mormon for understandable reasons. Most of the citizens of the towns surrounding Nauvoo could be classified as anti-Mormons by late 1843, but the crucial point here is reminiscent of what happened with the Missouri State Militia during the 1838 Missouri Mormon War. Members of the state militia were citizens of the state, which were the people impacted by the Mormons who harbored the strongest grudges against them to begin with. It was impossible to gather an impartial militia to execute the due process of law when the militias were comprised of people who owned property the Mormons had stolen, or they held a note against the Mormons that was 2 years overdue or something to that effect. It was impossible for a militia and the commanding officers of said militia to remain objective and impartial to the Mormon problem. The result of Governor Boggs calling out the militia against the Mormons in 1838 was everything getting dramatically blown out of proportion, and the only solution left for Missouri was to kick the Mormons out of the state. The governor of Illinois, Thomas Ford, elected in 1842, knew this same problem hampered his abilities to deal with the Nauvoo Mormon problem. If he called out the Illinois State Militia, they'd be just as mad at the Mormons as the Missouri Militia was in 1838, and armed conflict would be the inevitable result. Thomas Ford's hands were tied. But the thing is, the Mormons in Nauvoo were far more terrifying than the Mormons in Missouri, because they had their own state-sanctioned militia, the Nauvoo Legion, which was larger than the Illinois State Militia, and the Nauvoo Legion was armed by the Illinois State Armory. Even if Thomas Ford wanted to put down the Nauvoo Mormon problem by militia force, the size of the army that he could call out would be outnumbered and outgunned by the Mormon army. With these forces at play, Levi Williams acted of his own volition in arresting Daniel and Philander Avery on horse theft charges, and he took the initiative of extraditing them to Missouri to answer for those charges. Horse theft was a charge which didn't infrequently result in hanging. As a result of this, Daniel and his son were released from Missouri, and upon their return to Nauvoo from Missouri, Daniel made an affidavit, which is included in the History of the Church, Volume 6. Now, this whole ordeal was labeled as kidnapping, but to be clear, Daniel Avery had an arrest warrant in the state of Missouri, but there's no evidence that a writ of extradition was ever signed by Governor Thomas Ford of Illinois, which would authorize Levi Williams to arrest the Averys in Illinois and extradite them to Missouri. So technically, it was sort of kidnapping, but Daniel Avery was a fugitive from justice while he was residing in Illinois, and was likely carrying on his horse theft practice while he was in Illinois. And of course, just like all criminals, Mormon criminals, I should say, he was protected by the municipal government of Nauvoo from any sort of prosecution. One of the men in the arresting posse was a person from whom Avery had stolen a horse, a guy named McCoy. So here are just a few extracts from his affidavit, which is dated December 28th, 1843, and was given in the presence of Joseph Smith himself. This is from the Dan Vogel History of the Church, Volume 6, beginning on page 162. Quote, Daniel Avery before me, Joseph Smith, saith that he was unlawfully arrested by force and arms and kidnapped at Doty's Mill by Colonel Levi Williams and his son John Williams, John Elliott, William Middleton, and Joseph McCoy of Clark County, Missouri, and 4 others. Colonel Williams held his bowie knife to his breast. 6 of the others stood with their pistols cocked and their fingers upon the triggers, muzzles presented at his body, ready to fire. And 2 stood with clubs, and amid the most horrid oaths and imprecations, took and bound with silk handkerchiefs your said affiant, and led him away between 2 men, one holding a savage bowie knife on one side and the other a cocked pistol on the other side, having taken away your said affiant's weapons while binding him in the mill, and led your affiant about a mile. Your affiant, of course, your affiant in all of this is Daniel Avery, refused to walk any further, and they put him upon a horse and tied his legs under the horse. They had bound me so tight that I was in great pain. We started for the river. They came to a halt, sent messengers to a meeting, and in the course of half an hour they returned with an armed mob, with rifles and other weapons sufficient to make the whole company number about 20. Being all on horseback, they formed a circle with your affiant in the center and marched in that order to a house on the point below Warsaw, Illinois. And as I was very cold from being bound, they took me into the house to warm. I now called for a trial, and I had told them that all the way I never resisted legal authority. They said they were hunting a magistrate. Says I understand you. You mean to force me into Missouri. McCoy returned. Now, of course, McCoy is the guy who apparently had his horse stolen by Daniel Avery. McCoy replied and said, We are ready. It was about midnight. We went about 300 yards up the river to a skiff. I refused to cross, as they promised me a trial. They forced me into a skiff and bound me, and 5 men put me across. End quote. So he expected that he would have a trial in Illinois instead of in Missouri. So just to briefly comment on this before reading a few more excerpts, the last thing that Avery wanted was to be taken across the Mississippi to Missouri to face his horse theft charges. A Mormon in Missouri didn't stand a chance of getting a fair and balanced trial, as we discussed earlier with the problems with the gathering a militia of citizens. When the citizens themselves are the ones that have a problem with the Mormons, the militia that is comprised of those citizens is going to be biased, and it is impossible for it to remain impartial. Same thing with having a jury trial. So the last thing that the posse wanted, though, was to remain in Illinois, because the Danites could have a search party out for Avery. See, the posse was in control of this situation, but the fact that they traveled under the cover of nightfall during all of this reveals that they knew, even if they had the proper documentation to arrest and extradite Daniel Avery, that they'd be used up by the Mormon mob in a second if the Danites saw that one of their brothers was in the hands of Missourians, the Missouri mobocrats. The same principle governed the conduct of Sheriffs Wilson and Reynolds when they arrested Joseph Smith in Dixon and tried to get him to Missouri back in June and July of 1843. They took back roads and often traveled by night so that the Danites couldn't find them and spring Joe free and leave the sheriffs for dead. Now, these sheriffs were unsuccessful, but they did escape Nauvoo with their lives, so luck was on their side. But this posse that arrested Daniel and Philander Avery knew that every minute they spent on the Illinois side of the Mississippi was borrowed time against their lives. Understandably, Avery didn't want to be tried in Missouri, but maintained his innocence through the whole ordeal the way that any arrested person should, of course. The posse got him across the river into the state of Missouri that night, and then they sent messengers to the Clark County seat where the trial was to be held against Daniel Avery. The sheriff that night came to see him at the tavern where the posse stayed for the remainder of the night. Quote, "The sheriff quizzed me the night before to draw something out for testimony, but his innocence cannot be affected with truth. He was as wise at one end of the story as the other. At Waterloo, I was examined by a magistrate who committed me upon the substance of an affidavit made by my son in duress with a bowie knife at his breast, and upon a promise that he should be liberated from Monticello jail, where he was confined after being kidnapped some 3 or 4 weeks previous. My bonds were fixed at $1,000, and as I had no bail in such a strange place, I was started for Palmyra Jail in Marion County. Here I sued out a writ of habeas corpus, but the judge remanded me to prison. At Monticello my chains were taken off, and I was at liberty to view the town, saw my son in prison, said he was forced at the point of a bowie knife to make an affidavit against me, but he knew I was innocent." End quote. So, Daniel Avery asked if he could be interred in the Monticello jail where his son Philander was, but he was denied that privilege. They instead removed him to the Palmyra jail where the blacksmith, quote, "ironed me to the middle of a great chain that was fast to the floor, where I remained in the horrid gloom of a Missouri prison 2 weeks." End quote. I mean, to be chained to the floor of a dungeon for 2 weeks in December in Missouri without fire heat, if there's a hell on earth, that would be it. But all things considered, Avery got off pretty easily. People didn't infrequently spend their lives in dungeons like this. Hell, even Pistol Pack and Porter Rockwell spent months not only chained to the floor, but also chained with his right wrist to his left ankle to, hobble him, to cripple him. This is basically corporal punishment doled out over an extended period of time. This was torture, but it was better than the gallows that might await a convicted horse thief. So Daniel Avery had his initial indictment based on the affidavit given by his son under duress. Quote, "I was informed that Middleton and McCoy procured an indictment against me by giving bonds to the amount of some $200 or $300, that they would hunt up testimony to the point for next court, there being nothing against me but the affidavit of my son before alluded to, and so the grand jury found a bill. Ellison, my lawyer, deceived me and put over my case for 6 months because, as I supposed, I being kidnapped had no fees for him. I objected to having my trial put off 6 months. I did not fancy the dungeon of Palmyra prison. The court concluded to let me bail under bonds of $1,000, but this I could not obtain. Subsequently, it was reduced to $500, but all in vain, for I was unacquainted with the people." End quote. Well, good thing America's legal system has worked out all of these injustices, and, stuff like this never happens anymore. Stuff like plea bargains signed under threat of harsher sentences, unreasonable bond for nonviolent criminals who aren't a travel risk with no means to pay those bonds, general mistreatment and lack of human decency provided to the prisoner. Whew, yeah, I'm glad that America got past all of this stuff. Well, none of that really mattered because Daniel Avery spent the weekend in jail, and on Monday, he sued out a writ of habeas corpus. Since the court only had Daniel's son's affidavit, that's Philander Avery, since they only had his affidavit and the accusation by McCoy of stealing the horse, they didn't have sufficient evidence to continue holding him in state custody, and he was released the next day. I will add that the end of his affidavit sworn to Joe is quite interesting. Upon his return to Nauvoo on that Tuesday afternoon, when he made this affidavit, he said, quote, "To those who assisted your said affiant to obtain his release from bondage, he tenders his grateful acknowledgments." End quote. So Daniel Avery, when he was released, he was just over the Mississippi River from Warsaw, Illinois. This whole ordeal spanning 2.5 weeks happened just 20 miles down the Mississippi from Nauvoo. He was released Tuesday morning and made the journey on foot home and arrived that same evening. Even though this did happen in Missouri, it happened just barely in Missouri, well within the confines of the jurisdiction of the Mormon criminal empire. Not legally speaking, because Nauvoo government had no power outside the confines of the city, but well within the crime family territory, which extended far beyond the boundaries of Nauvoo. So nobody really knows what actually happened here, but Daniel Avery initially had a bond of $1,000 put on his head, and then the next day he walks, possibly pointing to something beneath the surface that no documentation would ever reveal, besides what he added at the very end of his affidavit: to those who assisted me in obtaining my release from bondage, I tender my grateful acknowledgments. This whole ordeal was branded as a kidnapping at the time, and you can see from the passage that I read from Marvin Hill and Alan Oak's book that narrative of kidnapping persists to this day, as propaganda often does. The guy who made the arrest, Levi Williams, is infamous in Mormon history circles. Levi Williams and Thomas Sharp are two of the most outspoken and prominent anti-Mormons in all of Nauvoo history. But that brings me to a question. What does the term anti-Mormonism mean? I mean, it's a weaponized term used to suffocate thought and stifle critical thinking today, but it hasn't always been this way. Anti-Mormonism has been a near constant presence in our timeline since the church was founded. Whether it was the Ezra Booth letters or it was Mormonism Unveiled, anti-Mormons have always filled the role of a necessary adversary to galvanize the Mormons against a common enemy. Since the Mormon presence in Illinois following their expulsion from Missouri, anti-Mormonism became a codified system of political power for the sole purpose of opposing the overreach of Mormon political power. The old citizens of Hancock and nearby counties in Illinois began the Mormon refugee settlement era with sympathy for these refugees. They felt pity for these poor, deluded religious fanatics. However, as Mormon power grew and the Nauvoo Legion became an increasingly imposing force to be reckoned with, anti-Mormonism grew in correlation. Now, anti-Mormon is a divisive term. Today, it means anybody who speaks out against the church for any reason. It's used as a demonization tactic, and it's incredibly effective. Sam Young, the guy trying to bring an end to bishops' worthiness interviews, is considered an anti-Mormon. This guy tried to make it so dentists and car salesmen are no longer allowed to ask teenagers about their masturbation habits one-on-one behind closed doors, but alas, Sam Young spoke out publicly against the church and held multiple public demonstrations against bishops' interviews, and he was excommunicated for it. Hey, listener, are you going to be in Salt Lake City this upcoming October 5th for the next march? Am I going to see you there? Information is in the show notes. I'd love to see you. But anti-Mormon can also mean anybody who tries to use the belief system of the church to make their own church, like Denver Snuffer or Chris Nemelka or any other fundamentalist sect leader or any of the leaders of any other Mormon group outside of the authority of the Salt Lake City headquartered church. All of them are anti-Mormons according to the downtown Salt Lake City corporate entity. But anti-Mormon can also mean people like yours truly who publish content about Mormon history which falls outside or counter to the correlated narrative that the institution creates. Anti-Mormons like Kay Burningham sue the church for fraud based on falsely representing their own history. Anti-Mormons attend Sunstone Symposium and John Whitmer Historical Association and present their research on church history and culture that sheds a troubling light on controversial information and practices. Some of these anti-Mormons are excommunicated, some of them are ignored, some are vilified. Each individual represents a unique case of anti-Mormon. My point is here, the term anti-Mormon today has such an expansive definition within the minds of believing folk, and it's used as a bludgeon to hide information, to quell insurrection, and to shut down necessary societal reforms. But it hasn't always been this way. Anti-Mormon during Joseph Smith's lifetime had a more pointed definition than today. An anti-Mormon in the 1830s and 40s was a person who opposed the church for any reason, but did so through active participation in groups who opposed the church. A single person like Eber D. Howe or John C. Reckitt Bennett may be an anti-Mormon, but they were figureheads of larger movements who opposed the growing power of Joe Smith and the Mormons. Anti-Mormons were a codified group, not a label slapped on anybody who doesn't agree with the religious tenets. Thomas Sharp was a well-known anti-Mormon out of Warsaw, Illinois, and Warsaw is a town about 20 miles south of Nauvoo along the Mississippi. His attendance at the Nauvoo Temple cornerstone ceremony in 1841 engendered feelings of absolute fear in his mind. He saw the Nauvoo Legion out in full force with 1,000 armed volunteers in full battle regalia. Prominent politicians attended the parade. Thousands of Mormons shouted Hosanna in the streets as the prophet spewed anti-American theocratic dogma. Thomas Sharp could see this was a problem in its early stages, and the Mormon regime was a worthy cause to oppose. He therefore founded the Anti-Mormon Party in Warsaw, which had vigorous support from nearby Carthage. The old citizens of Illinois, just like the old citizens of Missouri, had to do something to combat this growing anti-American threat. Now, they had reasons outside of the growing political threat to oppose the Mormons. It turns out the Mormons were bad neighbors. Here are a couple of extracts from newspapers, nationwide newspapers that talk about this. Quote, this is from the Boone's Lick Times out of Fayette, Missouri in September of 1843. Quote, Great Anti-Mormon Meeting. In the St. Louis papers, we find the proceedings of a great anti-Mormon meeting held at Carthage, Hancock County, Illinois, at which a preamble and resolutions were adopted, complaining of the Mormons and denouncing them as a set of thieves and vagabonds. The meeting passed a resolution pledging themselves to stand by one another and visit the unlawful proceedings of the Mormons to death if necessary. It also includes one of the resolutions. Resolved, number 6, that we pledge ourselves in the most determined manner, that if the authorities of the state of Missouri shall make another demand for the body of Joseph Smith, and our government shall issue another warrant to stand ready at all times to serve the officer into whose hands such a warrant may come as a posse, in order that it may not be said of us in future that the most outrageous culprits have been suffered to go unwhipped of justice. End quote. Here's from the Bangor Daily Whig and Courier in Maine, and also September of 1843. Now, this is all obviously reactions to Joseph Smith going free after he was arrested by Sheriffs Wilson and Reynolds in late June and early July of 1843, and all of the court proceedings that followed. Once again, quote, Anti-Mormon movements. The Iowa Hawkeye speaks of the Anti-Mormon Convention as being very large and as having passed resolutions declaring that if Governor Ford would not surrender Joe Smith on the requisition of Governor of Missouri, which he has refused to do for political considerations, that they would call in aid from other counties and other states to assist them in delivering him up. As were prevalent that a number of the citizens had had their lives threatened by the Mormons, the meeting resolved to avenge any blood that might be so shed. They agreed not to obey the mandates of the Mormon officers of the county who have been put in power by the Mormons, the whole county treasury being now at their disposal. The excitement in Indiana and Iowa is very great, and it is feared that a crisis is rapidly approaching that will involve thousands in a conflict of terrible consequences. Joe Smith, the prophet, has 20,000 well-armed troops, and they are urged on by blind zeal and religious fanaticism. End quote. Yeah, the Mormons were bad neighbors. Here's from the Vermont Watchman and State Journal out of Montpelier, also in September 1843. Quote, There is considerable excitement. The crisis seems to be rapidly approaching, and we greatly fear the consequences. All may be remedied if the Mormons as a religious body will but eschew politics and amalgamate with our citizens, but we fear it is too late to do even that. End quote. You see, the anti-Mormon political party was working its best within the confines of the law to roll back or curtail the ever-expanding power of the Mormon political machine in Nauvoo. Now, we might view these things as like a flame war before there was a Twitter, right? But these meetings and these resolutions had real effect, and they merited real responses from the Nauvoo municipal government. There was, however, a power imbalance when we compare the Mormon political party and the anti-Mormon political party. You see, the anti-Mormons could pass resolutions, but didn't have the binding power of like a city charter, which put the resolutions into place. That meant that these resolutions were little more than sternly worded letters. However, the city of Nauvoo and its criminal empire could pass actual resolutions that were recognized by the governor of Illinois as legally binding. These meetings in late 1843 were held in response to Joe evading the law once again when Sheriffs Reynolds and Wilson arrested him and the Nauvoo Municipal Court released him on a writ of habeas corpus. The old citizens of Illinois wanted Joe to answer for his crimes, as they saw this was the only reasonable way to curtail this expansive power of the Mormon kingdom, the kingdom of God of Israel. I mean, you cut off the head of the demon and the demon dies, right? Well, little did they know this demon was actually a hydra, but they would learn that in less than a year. So these non-binding resolutions meant that the citizens of Carthage and Warsaw were willing to call in the militia from Illinois and Missouri and Iowa and Indiana in order to effect the long-awaited arrest of the great tyrant Joe Smith. But once again, these were just sternly worded letters declaring intent and desire. They weren't binding, and they had no real effect if Governors Ford and Reynolds of Illinois and Missouri, respectively, weren't willing to go along with the resolutions. Regardless of the fact that these were not actually binding, a response was required from the Nauvoo government, with Joe chairing as mayor of the city. They called a public meeting to pass a new resolution on December 7th, 1843. This meeting was called, and the resolution passed once the city had learned that Daniel Avery was arrested and was taken to Missouri. It was passed while he was literally in chains in Missouri. When the Nauvoo resolution talks about kidnapping, the Avery situation is what it's referring to. They were afraid a similar quote-unquote kidnapping fate might befall other members of the church or even the prophet himself, and they decided to make an actually binding resolution preemptively in order to insulate church leadership. Here we go. Quote, "In response, relative to the repeated unlawful demands of the state of Missouri for the body of General Joseph Smith, as well as the common cruel practice of kidnapping citizens, Daniel Avery, of Illinois and forcing them across the Mississippi River and then incarcerating them in dungeons or prisons in Missouri, passed the following. Whereas the state of Missouri continues to make demands upon the executive of Illinois for the body of General Joseph Smith, as we verily believe, to keep up a system of persecution against the Church of the Latter-day Saints," there it is, persecution. Yeah, trying to bring the church and the leadership of it into line with this system of law that we all agree to abide by and all pay our taxes in order to enforce, and that is termed as persecution. That's what they used. Persecution. It's a persecution narrative that is alive and well in the church today. Persecution against the Church of the Latter-day Saints for the purpose of justifying the said state of Missouri in her diabolical, unheard of, cruel, and unconstitutional warfare against said church, in which she has practiced during the last 12 years, whereby many have been murdered, mobbed, and ravished, and the whole community expelled from the state. Therefore, resolved unanimously, as we do know that Joseph Smith is not guilty of any charge made against him by the said state of Missouri, but is a good, industrious, well-meaning, and worthy citizen of Illinois, and an officer who does faithfully and impartially administer the laws of the state, that we as citizens of Illinois crave the protection of the Constitution and laws of the country as an aegis to shield him. The said General Joseph Smith from such cruel persecutions, beseeching the governor of Illinois not to make any more writs against the said General Joseph Smith or other Latter-day Saints, unless they are guilty, but to let the Latter-day Saints breathe a while like other men and enjoy the liberty guaranteed to every honest citizen by the Magna Charta of our common country. Resolved, that we solicit the attention of the governor and officers to take some lawful means to prevent the said Missourians from committing further violence upon the citizens of Illinois. Resolved unanimously, that we solicit the Governor Ford, by all honorable means to grant us peace, for we will have it. And that, in the actual resolution, "for we will have it," is italicized with emphasis. For we will have it, or what? Or what? What if the governor does not grant you peace by all honorable means? We will have it. And here is the meat of the ordinance, and it's added an extra ordinance for the case, for the extra case of Joseph Smith and others. Here we go. This is just incredible. Whereas Joseph Smith has been 3 times arrested and 3 times acquitted upon writs founded upon supposed crimes preferred by the state of Missouri, and whereas it has become intolerable to be thus continually harassed and robbed of our money to defray the expenses of these prosecutions, therefore, be it ordained by the City Council of Nauvoo that hereafter, if any person or persons shall come with process, demand, or requisition founded upon the aforesaid Missouri difficulties to arrest said Joseph Smith, he or they shall be subject to be arrested by any officer of the city with or without process, and tried by the municipal court. Upon testimony, and if found guilty, sentenced to imprisonment in the city prison for life, which convict or convicts can only be pardoned by the governor with the consent of the mayor of said city. End quote. I know that was a long reading, but it's important to capture the mentality of this meeting during which this resolution was passed. And I'll tell you, I did cut a lot from this to spare you undue boredom. But this ordinance is incredibly important. The anti-Mormons could pass resolutions all day, but those didn't actually amount to anything more than a wagged finger and a printed outlet for their frustrations that they would then send to Governor Thomas Ford of Illinois. The Mormons, on the other hand, had complete and total control of Nauvoo. When they passed resolutions and ordinances, those had legal effect, even if they were blatantly unconstitutional, like imprisoning officers of the law for life for merely serving arrest warrants. And then, once they are convicted by the Nauvoo Municipal Court and sentenced to prison for life, they can only be pardoned by the governor with the consent of Joseph Smith. If you're an enemy to Mormonism, if you're an anti-Mormon trying to arrest a Mormon in 1844, well, good luck. You're probably going to go to jail for life. This new ordinance, after it was passed, it was published in the Nauvoo Neighbor of the 13th of December, 1843, and it was quickly circulated to nearby cities. The Anti-Mormon political party decided that this was a step too far, and they chose to hold their own meeting in the final days of December 1843, and this was published in the Warsaw Message of the 3rd of January, 1844. The Warsaw Message was what the Warsaw Signal, the paper that was edited by Thomas Sharp. The Warsaw Message was what the Warsaw Signal used to be when Thomas Sharp sold it, and then it would revert back to the Warsaw Signal when he took over the helm of editing duties again in February of 1844. Here it is from the Warsaw Message of January 3rd, 1844. Quote, "At a meeting of the anti-Mormon citizens held at Green Plains, on motion, Colonel Levi Williams, the guy who arrested Daniel Avery in the first place, was called to the chair and H.P. Crawford chosen secretary. On motion, it was first resolved that the citizens of Green Plains request the Central Committee to forward a certain extra Nauvoo neighbor," that's what we just read, "published December 1843 to Governor Ford, informing him of our situation and that we wish redress for our grievances." So basically, they said, we got to send a copy of this paper to Governor Ford so he knows what they're doing. He knows that anyone who tries to arrest Joseph Smith or any Mormons can be sentenced to prison for life. Second resolve, that the chairman and secretary of this meeting forwarded said extra Nauvoo neighbor to the governor of Missouri with suitable comments on the same. Third resolved, that we request the authorities of the state of Missouri to make a demand for such individuals as have transgressed their laws and fled to our state, especially Joe Smith, the false prophet. End quote. Basically, the anti-Mormon political party knew this new Nauvoo resolution had far-reaching and dire implications. It essentially made anybody in Nauvoo completely immune from the nationwide criminal justice system. Now, this was a long-running trend in Nauvoo, right? A Joseph Smith crony would commit a crime, he'd be arrested, and then witnesses would be produced, and Joe would chair the municipal court hearing, and then the guy would be let off without even a slap on the wrists. That's how Nauvoo kept faithful members of the church out of the criminal justice system of Illinois and Missouri, and it was effective, and it was employed daily. Now, because of this new resolution, there was yet another layer of protection for these Mormon criminals. If a Mormon stole somebody's property anywhere, like Daniel Avery stealing a horse in Missouri, for example, and a sheriff or a member of the Illinois or Missouri militia came into Nauvoo and attempted to arrest the suspect, that sheriff or militiaman would themselves be arrested and have to plead their case before the Nauvoo Municipal Court. If, for any reason, their actions were seen as unjustified by the Nauvoo Mormon leadership, the Nauvoo Municipal Court, the Nauvoo government, these terms are synonymous, that officer of the law would be committed to the Nauvoo jail for a life sentence. This was understandably terrifying for anybody on the receiving end of these draconian mafia laws. Accordingly, the citizens of Warsaw and Carthage decided to take measures to simply keep the Mormons out of their towns. The power that was granted by this resolution extended beyond the confines of Nauvoo. So if a Mormon committed a crime in Warsaw and in Carthage, like stealing a man's horse, and that Mormon was arrested, the Nauvoo Legion could march into the town, storm the jail where that Mormon was confined, and then put him and the arresting officer in their custody and bring them to Nauvoo for a hearing, which would result in the arresting officer being thrown in jail for life. So the rest of the points in this resolution made it so Mormons seen in Carthage and Warsaw would be removed by the citizens. Quote, "Fourth, resolved that any of our citizens seeing a suspicious character lurking around, that we find out, if possible, his business and give him our opinion of spies and bad characters." Mormons. Fifth, resolved that we use our utmost energy to ferret out all dishonest persons, Mormons, in our section of country, whether Mormons or not. Sixth, resolved that so far as we are concerned about Joe and his legion and his threats, we ask him no favors. Signed, Levi Williams as chairman. End quote. You see, the Mormons had a ton of power, and the anti-Mormons acted reactively to attempt some kind of mitigation of that power, even if that meant they just simply chased Mormons out of their towns by calling them spies or bad characters. Mormonism was the one infringing on people's rights here, and an opposing force was necessary to restore and maintain those rights that were being infringed upon by Mormonism. That's the overall point here. Anti-Mormonism is purely reactionary. It exists because Mormonism is a force of nature to be dealt with somehow. That's just as true of the 1840s to combat Joe's criminal regime as it is today's anti-Mormons combating the Salt Lake City criminal regime. A tax-exempt organization that takes and takes and takes from the world community while giving nothing back, while making billions of dollars a year in shadow money with no transparency, covering up sex abuse and trafficking, holding to doctrines of religious, sexual, and racial supremacy, all while never admitting fault or apologizing for bigotry, for inciting hatred and committing genocide, and waging political warfare on the world stage where it doesn't belong. The modern church is guilty of far greater atrocities than Joseph Smith ever committed in his 14 years as prophet. Anti-Mormonism wouldn't exist if Mormonism didn't do things worth opposing. Mormonism is the aggressor in this equation, both in Joseph Smith's ministry and in the modern church. Mormonism itself is the problem, and the blatantly immoral way in which the leadership conducts the church activities and directions is what creates anti-Mormonism. Anti-Mormon isn't anti-Mormons. The vast majority of Mormons are great people. They're my family. They're my friends. Mormonism is the problem here, and what anti-Mormon people oppose. It's the religion that's the problem, not the people sitting in the pews. Maybe one day, Mormonism will stop infringing on the rights of people and common decency, and anti-Mormonism will be obsolete. Maybe one day, anti-Mormonism will no longer have to fight for equal rights and against religious and racial supremacy. Maybe anti-Mormonism will have the wind taken out of its sails because Mormonism no longer tells LGBTQ plus people that they're less than human or they aren't normal. Maybe anti-Mormons won't have to rely on leaks to see the face of the financial demon hiding behind the granite edifices with no accountability. Maybe one day, Mormonism will give 10% of its billions to charity like it requires of all of its members, and a whole renaissance of new hospitals and schools and low-income housing and public works projects will spring up all over the planet. Maybe one day, Mormonism will help secular authorities prosecuting rapists in the leadership instead of comforting those rapists by draping the shroud of Curtin McConkey's legal safety blanket over their shoulders and, just telling them, everything's going to be fine. You just keep your mouth shut and you let us handle that. Until that time, until that day, until that year, until that generation of Mormonism, if somebody calls you an anti-Mormon, maybe instead of treating it as a slight, it's time to consider that a badge of honor. I wanted to address last week's show about the Council of 50. If you didn't catch it, or if this is your first episode, last episode, the third of our Council of 50 series, it was an alternative history. Now, we've done alternate history twice in this podcast before. The first time was an interview that I did with Mark Hoffman. The second was the history of Liverpool by Jonas Pierce. That was back on episode 127. I still get emails about that episode from people who thought that was real. Well, look at the release date of that episode and then Google Samhain. It's a Gaelic tradition when the divisions between the natural and the supernatural are thinnest, and it's celebrated by storytelling. Samhain is what Halloween is based on. So I've kind of pondered for a long time what American history would look like if Joseph Smith didn't die in Carthage and lived long enough to see his wildest dreams come true. What if he escaped Carthage? What if he was never interred in Carthage? What if, Congress granted him his request for 100,000 soldiers to march across the country and conquer the remaining wilderness? What if he was elected president, right? I've had these questions bouncing around in my mind for years, and a few people have reached out in the past and asked if an alternate history like this exists or what my version might look like. I'm not aware of any alternate history with Joseph surviving Carthage or not even going to Carthage, although I'm sure there are some out there. As for my own version of Joseph Smith's alternate history, it's so dependent on so many variables that nearly any version of alternative history can be imagined. The version that I constructed in last week's show is completely impossible, but that's the joy of historical fiction. It can be whatever we want it to be, right? I chose to construct a version of American history that experienced Joseph Smith's wildest dreams coming true. You see, I disagreed with historian D. Michael Quinn about his high-level assessment of the Council of 50 because I felt he based his judgment on its results more than on its intention. The alternative history that I created was based solely on the intention of the Council of 50, and if it were actually used the way that Joe intended it to be from its inception. Besides, I mean, what do you expect the Utah years of this podcast to look like? So that leaves a few interesting questions up for speculation. How far were we, in America, realistically away from that version or some version of history like that happening? To what degree did that history not happen through bad lawmaking and sheer incompetence alone? How far are we from that today? Joe had grand plans, right? And he was often terrible at executing his grand plans. But what if Joseph Smith had the Midas touch and his career turned out how he wanted and expected it to? What would an American Mormon theocracy look like? What would the system of Mormonite law look like? Would non-believers like yours truly have a place to exist under such a system? What modern systems of theocracy closely resemble what could be expected if an American Mormon theocracy existed? So today's podcast was an illustration of the necessity of anti-Mormonism. On a personal level, I vehemently oppose Mormon political power. I oppose all religion, but Mormonism particularly is the single wealthiest religion in America and is vastly overrepresented by sheer number of Mormon politicians with respect to the non-Mormon population. today we run a pretty low risk of America devolving into a Mormonite law Mormon theocracy, right? But people living in the 1844 watching Joe run for president, they didn't have the luxury of historical hindsight that we enjoy today. The idea of a Mormon theocracy was far more prescient and a realistic threat to the people in the 1840s than it is to us today. Painting a picture of history requires capturing the mindset of the people who lived through it. So not only did I include quotes from contemporaries, but I did my best to put myself into the mindset of myself living in a dystopian Mormon theocratic future. This was revealed through subtle hints throughout the episode referencing the limited information that we have and not being able to trust information before the last few minutes where I finally talked about my families and the Nauvoo Legion in present terms and the division of the three kingdoms and what used to be the United States and all of the stuff at the end of the episode. That's why I tried to use the term Lamanites and descendants of Cain in that episode outside of reading quotes, because in an alternate reality, indigenous people and African Americans today could be referred to by those terms. Most importantly, the episode last week was an exercise in the importance of context. Every time I said quote on the episode, those were real quotes. Almost exclusively quotes that I have read on the show before in their proper historical context. Think back and try to remember, when did it hit you that the episode, the third episode in the Council of 50 series was a fabrication? When did that hit you? Was it when I talked about the publishers of the Nauvoo Expositor being thrown in labor camps? Was it when Rigdon campaigned and collected signatures to speak before Congress and finally passed the 100,000 soldiers bill? Maybe when the timeline moved past June of 1844 and Joe never went to Carthage jail and he certainly didn't die. Did it take as long as when Joe was actually elected president to realize that this was an alternate history? How about when the South seceded in 1845 instead of in 1860? That disharmony, that cognitive dissonance hitting your brain happened because you have a passing familiarity with American and Mormon history, so you could detect the forgery. To someone who knows nothing of either subject, it could be mostly plausible, or at least tough to tell what was real and what wasn't. But upon critical examination, it was so clearly fiction. The characters were one-dimensional, crucial details were lacking, the military campaigns were quickly done away with in a paragraph or two, when military history is arguably one of the most fascinating subfields of history because military history is so complex. All the Native American tribes were just fish in a barrel, when in reality, colonialism was far messier and more disturbing than what I described. Frankly, a lot of that episode read a lot like the Book of Mormon, with a nearly invincible Nauvoo Legion and overwhelming military victories with minimal casualties, and then, of course, we had Bloody Brigham on the south, and then Lyman White in Texas holding their posts perfectly, and millions of people resettling in new locations, entire cities burned to the ground with no mercy. It was all so fantastical. It was all a fantasy. Those are all points of historical context, and that's one of the main points that I wanted to get across in making the episode. History without context means nothing. History without context is how apologetics works. Apologetics comes from all angles, right? Believers claim that ex-Mormons or anti-Mormons take quotes out of context to build a case that the church is false, and ex-Mormons claim that believers refuse to understand historical context because it would inevitably destroy their testimony. Context cuts in all directions, and that's an important point to realize. Whether it's Fair Mormon or it's the CES letter, those are by no means equivalent. Don't mistake the point that I'm making here. Both resources lack perspective and context. From the beginning, I've tried my best to give you that all-important historical context in this podcast. I use this historical fiction to paint a portrait of Mormon beliefs because what I described were the blueprints to its foundation. Once again, what do you think Utah's going to look like in this podcast, right? That's what our future holds. But the thing is, Joe was a hopeless failure at many things that he tried to accomplish. The episode was a historical fiction, but the analogy that I made still holds. If a guy kills somebody, that's horrible. If a guy attempts to kill somebody, but is thwarted by either intervention from outside forces or by his own incompetence, the intent is the same. The motivation to kill somebody is the same. Last episode was a historical fiction built squarely on the intent of the religion from its inception. And we have plenty of grounds to judge Joseph Smith's Mormonism based on what it accomplished, but I would argue it's far more important to judge it on the grounds of what he envisioned that it could accomplish. We can't prove a person's intent when they've been dead for over a century and a half, but we can make informed speculation based on their actions. Now, and I've called Joseph Smith evil on this show before, and that's admittedly too simplistic. The reality is, Joe was a complex guy who challenged everything. He pushed every societal construct to the point of breaking, and then he kept pushing. He was unrelenting in his aspirations, but too impotent or too lazy to bring them to reality, and the world is better for his dramatic incompetence. So when I'm tagged in social media threads of somebody trying to understand the quote-unquote real reason that Joe was shot in Carthage, all I can think of is, how did the guy survive for so long with tens of thousands wanting him dead for the majority of his career? You want to know the real reason Joseph Smith was assassinated? Well, how long you got? Because we're going to be talking about this for hours before you have a solid contextual foundation for what happened that day in Carthage. If there's one lesson to take away from, 171 episodes of this show, and particularly from last week's Council of 50 Part 3, it's that context is everything. This also kind of plays into an email that I received from Jessica Audbeer. Hopefully I said that correctly, but Jessica sent in an email last week, and I said, I am going to respond to this on air because there's kind of a lot to tease out, and I tried to kind of interweave the point into today's episode of the podcast, but this is essentially what Jessica said. Dear Bryce, I need your help. I have very few friends, and 3 I call close friends. Recently, I visited one of them, a person I've known since high school. This person knows I was raised atheist and that my extended family on my father's side is Mormon. Here's where things get tricky. Now, essentially, I'm going to do my best to summarize, but essentially, the person was claiming that Jessica, being opposed to the church and opposed to religion in general, means that she's a bigot. Jessica says, her argument was that my views on church being negative because kid rape and lies and murder and codified sexism and racism, very reasonable in my humble opinion, were bigoted and are the same as why the Catholics were treated badly because of their religion and supposed allegiance to the Pope over country. That I am just as bad as the Protestants during that time period. And this is where Jessica actually asks a question. Now, is it fair to say that I am anti-religion, but is bigot the correct term? Is my argument that atheists are barred by law to serve in government services in a good number of states a valid reason to explain that I am harmed by religion? Now, let me just deal with that point very briefly. The arguments that atheists will often make that atheists can't hold a public office in various states for various reasons or by law, those are fallacious arguments that has been overturned by a Supreme Court ruling. Those laws no longer hold effect. Those are just words on paper. They're fish wrap, right? They're like the resolutions that the Anti-Mormons published in this week's episode. They're just words. They're pointless. So to make that argument is fallacious. Don't claim that atheists can't hold office. Instead, ask a question. Who was the last atheist president that we had? Oh, wait. I'm still waiting. Anybody? Anybody want to stand up? George Washington was a deist. Okay, when was the last non-Christian president that we had? George Washington, he was a deist. He did write about Jesus Christ a little bit. He was not a Christian. Since then, anybody? How about since the 1950s and the Red Scare and the rise of the Christian radical right? When was the last Christian or non-Christian president that we had since then? None? Nobody? Silence. Okay, so I think that's a more powerful point to make. When was the last non-Christian prominent politician that you knew of? Okay? Or non-Abrahamic religion. Even say non-Abrahamic religion. That's, I think, an even more powerful argument to make. So atheists are not barred by law from serving in political office, but it just so happens that the political realm and the perspective of the public is such that it's very hard for an atheist to get elected to the office. Anyway, Jessica makes the point, I trust you and I'm afraid I lost a decades-old friendship over this argument, but I don't want to be a bigot. Can you help me sort through this morally? This is a point that I have tried to make on this podcast before, and I'm going to keep blowing the horn on this because this is an issue that plays into the Mormon persecution narrative and the religious persecution narrative. A person is not their religion. There is a difference between a system of beliefs that a person holds to and a person's identity. So when a Christian says, love the sinner, not the sin, it's this idea of, it's usually used towards, LGBTQ people of like, I love you as a person. I just don't like who you are because you are gay, right? That is a sin. I don't like what you do. But there's this line that needs to be divided between a person's conduct and a person's identity, what a person does versus who a person is. Mormonism, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints versus Mormons. Right. And oftentimes people will conflate the system of their beliefs with their identity. They will be so deeply entrenched into a belief system that it will become a part of their identity, but they aren't Mormon from birth. So if you are making an argument against Mormonism, you're not making an argument against Mormons. You're making an argument against a set of beliefs and an institution. There's a very important difference to make. When a person is making an argument against people having equal marriage, so when a person is being a bigot towards gay people getting married, that is bigotry because you are hating the person's identity. You are hating an attribute of them. When I hate Mormonism, I am not hating a person's identity. I'm not hating a person specifically. I can hate Dallin H. Oaks for being a bigot. I can hate him because of his conduct. I don't hate him because he is a Mormon and he is using that as a part of his identity. There is a subtle difference and it needs to be teased out. It needs to be well understood. If you hate a person's belief system, you are not hating the person. You can hate Mormonism without hating Mormons. And I've said that before. I've said it again. I'm going to say it many more times. Mormons are some of the greatest people I know. Mormons are my friends and family. Mormonism is what is the problem. It's anti-Mormon, not anti-Mormons. It's anti-Mormonism, not anti-Mormons. So the more that you can tease out the differences in a person's belief system, which is subject to change at the drop of a hat, versus who a person is, the more I feel like you're going to make headway in those conversations, Jessica. So hopefully that is a fair treatment of how to tease this apart morally. If you hate Mormonism, you are not a bigot. You are just somebody who is ideologically opposed to a system of beliefs. Those are ideas. Those are not people. So, Jessica, I hope that answers your question. All in all, thank you so much for sending it, and also for sending me a pronunciation guide on your last name, Outbeer. Did I say it right? Outbeer? Anyway, okay, so to wrap up, we have a couple of announcements. Coming up on October 5th in Salt Lake City is the next March for the Children. This is the Protect LDS Children movement that is turned into Protect Every Child, and it is once again organized by Sam Young and Protect Every Child to oppose the church's practices of bishops' interviews. Because as it stands right now, bishops are pulling kids in behind closed doors one-on-one, and they're asking them about how they masturbate and asking them all sorts of sexually invasive questions that stranger adults wouldn't ask each other, that good friends who are adults would never ask each other. But here we have, 40, 50, 60-year-old dudes who were not trained in anything mental health related or sex therapy related or relationship advice. They have absolutely no foundation and no training to ask extremely probing and invasive questions, and they're doing so to teenagers. And it is an abusive system. It's an abusive practice that needs to stop. So the next March for the Children is going to be October 5th. You're going to find information for it in the show notes. It's going to be in downtown Salt Lake City. This happened last year, March 30th, 2018, when 1,000 people marched through the streets of downtown Salt Lake City, shut down the city, and stood on the doorsteps of the church office building in downtown near Temple Square and handed the sacred stories from sacred children to leading officials of the church. The next march is coming. Are you going to be there? We're a month away, October 5th. You're going to find links to it in the show notes. Also, quick announcement, going to be a John Whitmer Historical Association coming up. That is in Fairport, which is near Rochester, New York, from September 26th through September 29th. Information and tickets are still available on jwha.info. You're going to find that in the show notes as well. It'd be really cool to see you there. If you have the opportunity to go to it, or if it's something that interests you, you can find the information in the show notes there. I'm going to be going and doing part of the trivia night and, hanging out with a lot of interesting people because it's a Mormon history conference, and Mormon history is a field full of a lot of interesting people. I will also let you know I'm setting up the episodes that are going to be airing during that and the following week after, because I'm going to be, immediately after John Wimmer, I'm going to be in Utah for the March for the Children. So those 2 weeks are going to be interview episodes with somebody who has a bit of expertise in history, and we're still working out the details of what the subject of discussion is going to be. But please be looking forward to that. We're going to be having, of course, the regular historical timeline episodes preceding that and following that, ending September 19th and then starting back up, of course, on October 10th. So that's a little forecast for what you can expect for the podcast coming up in the future. We also have a few new patrons to thank. We have a new pledge by Darren and a new pledge by Anthony. So to our new patrons over at patreon.com/nakedmormonism, thank you so much for pledging to support the show and giving some of your hard-earned money to this research endeavor. Hopefully you're enjoying all of the extra content that all of the listeners get over there on the Patreon exclusive feed, whether that is the NAMO Book Club, the NAMO Hangouts, NAMO Home Evening Hangouts, or whether that is just the extended edition of every new episode. You're still getting extra content. And for all the people who do support the show, new patrons, old patrons, all the patrons, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. With that, we're going to go ahead and shut the episode of the podcast down for the evening. Thank you so much for lending me your ear. Hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as social media manager, Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer, and Andrew Torres of the law offices of P. Andrew Torres in the Opening Arguments podcast as legal counsel. Music is written and performed by Jason Camo of aloststateofmind.com and used with permission. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2019, all rights reserved.